You lie back, your body easing into stillness, and as you allow yourself to sink into the rhythm of your own breath, you sense how the mind drifts outward toward the vastness of space. For it is natural, almost instinctive, to look at the stars and feel a tug, a gentle ache of curiosity, a longing that has lived inside humanity since the first eyes tilted upward to the night sky, and in that longing lies a spark, quiet but enduring, a dream that whispers. Could we ever reach them? Could we ever drift beyond our sun, across the distances that seem infinite? You imagine early humans sitting by fires, watching the glitter of constellations, weaving them into stories, not because they thought travel was possible, but because imagination itself is a form of motion, a way to reach out across the unbridgeable. And as centuries turned to millennia, that spark only grew brighter, guiding sailors across oceans, guiding astronomers as they charted planets, guiding poets who filled their words with the silver of the moon, and eventually guiding scientists who began to ask not only what is out there, but how might we go? You picture the slow blossoming of technology. First ships, then engines, then rockets that roared upward and slipped into orbit, fragile needles carrying fragments of human presence in the sky, and each step, no matter how small, carried that ancient longing forward. You recall the first satellites, beeping their steady signals back to Earth, then the first human footsteps on the moon, echoes across dust that had been silent for billions of years, and with each echo, the dream grew bolder. If we can cross oceans, and if we can cross space to our moon, perhaps we can one day cross the space between stars. Yet as you rest in this thought, you feel the scale of the challenge. For the stars are not merely far, they are unimaginably distant. So far that even light, the fastest travel in the universe, takes years, centuries, millennia to reach from one to another. And when you think of human spacecraft, creeping outward at speeds that feel great to us but are barely a whisper compared to light, you realize how small we are, how enormous the gap truly is. Still, the dream remains and the spark glows, because in the mind there is no limit, and in imagination you can leap across light years in a single breath. Scientists, too, let their imaginations wander, but with discipline, with mathematics, with experiments, asking, what engines could carry us faster? What fuels could release enough energy to push a starship beyond the boundaries of our solar system? You breathe deeply. And as you exhale, you begin to sense the answer that emerge in whispers of theory and flashes of discovery. Antimatter, the mirror of matter, the most dazzling, dangerous, and elegant possibility for powering journeys to the stars. You imagine the idea itself, quiet at first, born in physics labs where particles are smashed together and their twins, opposites, mirror beings flicker briefly into existence before vanishing again. And in those flickers, scientists saw both beauty and potential, for antimatter is a perfect partner to matter, and when they meet, they annihilate in a burst of pure energy, nothing wasted, nothing left behind but light and heat, the most efficient release of energy the universe allows. You picture this as a candle compared to the sun, a match compared to a lightning strike, the difference between chemical fuel and antimatter, so vast it feels like poetry written in physics. To dream of antimatter rockets is to dream of harnessing the most complete fire imaginable, of bottling the annihilation of opposites, of turning that into thrust that could carry a ship not just to Mars or Jupiter, but perhaps to another star. And as you lie here imagining, you feel the gentleness of the question. What if the key to star travel lies not in inventing something new, but in learning to use something the universe already offers? You let yourself drift into the simplicity of the image. A starship gliding through the dark, its engines glowing faintly with light born of matter and antimatter meeting, vanishing, leaving behind only pure motion, pure fire, a dance so absolute that every atom is turned into energy. The idea itself is almost too beautiful, like imagining wings made of starlight, yet it is real, grounded in the laws of physics, not science fiction but science fact, though one still far from reach. You realize that this quiet spark of an idea is what makes it so soothing, for it asks nothing immediate, it makes no demand. It is a dream that can unfold slowly, like your breath, like the earth itself drifting through space. You feel the comfort of knowing that humanity's longing for stars has already found its most dazzling partner, that somewhere in the equations and experiments, antimatter waits, a mirror waiting for its reflection, a promise waiting to be unlocked. You breathe again, steady and calm. And as you breathe, you realize that to understand this dream more deeply, you must first understand the mirror itself, the nature of antimatter, where it comes from, why it exists, and how it reveals the symmetry at the heart of the universe. And so, softly, you let your thoughts drift forward from the quiet spark of a cosmic idea into the next chapter, where the story of antimatter itself begins, matter's shadow waiting to be seen. You breathe softly, letting the air fill you, and then leave you, and in that rhythm you begin to feel the strange symmetry that lies at the heart of existence. For every inhale has its exhale, every crest of a wave has its trough, every light has its shadow, and in physics there's a partner to matter, a reflection so precise that it seems to whisper a balance of duality, of a universe woven from pairs. And this partner is called antimatter, a name that sounds like opposition but truly means symmetry, a mirror held up to particles that make you, me, and the stars themselves. And as you rest in this thought, you imagine a single electron, a particle so tiny you could not see it with even the finest microscope, carrying its negative charge, dancing the atom like a planet around the sun. And then imagine its twin, the positron, identical in mass, identical in spin, identical in every measure except one. It carries a positive charge, the opposite sign, and this single difference makes it antimatter, the reflection in the cosmic mirror. You let your mind expand outward, the proton with its positive charge, mirrored by the antiproton with its negative, the neutron neutral but composed of quarks, mirrored by the antineutron, composed of antiquarks, each particle you know balanced by its antiparticle, and you sense that the universe itself is written in pairs, yin and yang at the level of physics, as though the cosmos itself insists on symmetry, and yet, as you let your thoughts drift further, you feel the paradox, for if matter and antimatter are truly symmetrical, if they are created in equal measure, then where is all the antimatter? The universe you see is made almost entirely of matter, from your hand to the earth to the galaxies, while antimatter seems hidden, rare, fleeting, vanishing whenever it appears. And this mystery is one of the deepest questions of physics. Why the symmetry was broken, why a tiny excess of matter remained after the Big Bang, leaving behind the atoms that built stars, planets, and life. You pause and let that mystery rest like a quiet, unanswered question, not to disturb you, but to remind you of the vastness of what is yet to be known. You imagine the birth of the universe itself, the first fractions of a second when matter and antimatter were created together, pairs flashing into existence, and then annihilating in bursts of light, matter meeting antimatter in the most intimate embrace, leaving behind only energy, until at last a small imbalance allowed some matter to survive, and from that survival, everything you know is born. You feel yourself as part of that improbable excess, a being made from the leftover side of a cosmic balance, and you let that awareness soothe you, for it means you are a child of symmetry, a being existing only because of a tiny tilt in the scale. You think of the places where antimatter is found today, not in everyday life, but in the high dances of cosmic rays striking the atmosphere, producing showers of particles that flicker and vanish in fractions of a second, or in the laboratories of physicists who coax positrons and antiprotons into existence in particle accelerators, capturing them briefly in magnetic bottles, studying their nature before they too vanish into light. And you realize that antimatter is not science fiction, but science fact, as real as your breath, as real as the ground beneath you, though it is rare, fragile, and fleeting. You let yourself imagine the strange beauty of annihilation, when a particle meets its mirror and both vanish, leaving behind only energy, no ash, no residue, no remainder, pure conversion, pure light. And you feel the elegance of it, as though the universe rode into its laws the most perfect efficiency, a transformation of matter into energy and totality. You think of Einstein's equation, E equals mc squared, the idea that mass and energy are two sides of one coin, and you realize annihilation is that equation fulfilled completely, matter becoming energy without remainder, a purity unmatched by any other process. And you sense why scientists dream of antimatter rockets, engines powered by this perfect fire. You imagine holding a single gram of antimatter, though in truth no one has ever done so, for to even touch ordinary matter will release an explosion beyond imagining. But in that single gram lies the energy of tens of thousands of tons of TNT, enough to power ships, to cross worlds, to change destinies. And you begin to feel how both dazzling and dangerous this mirror is. You breathe again, steady. And as you breathe, you picture antimatter not as threat, but as beauty, as a reflection that teaches you about balance, about the structure of the universe, about the hidden elegance beneath appearances. You let your mind drift into metaphor, antimatter as a reflection in water, delicate, easily broken, vanishing when disturbed, yet still real, still part of the world. Antimatter is the echo in a canyon, the twin of a voice that vanishes the moment it meets the air. Antimatter is a shadow of your body, always present but never touchable, defined by opposition yet inseparable. You realize that to truly know antimatter is to know the universe's insistence on duality, on symmetry, and to know that even in its absence, its rarity, it shapes your existence, for without it, the balance of the early cosmos would have been different, and you would not be here. You let this thought comfort you, the knowledge that you live in a universe built not only from what remains, but from what was lost, a universe where matter's shadow still lingers in cosmic rays, in laboratory bottles, in bursts of gamma light when positrons annihilate, a reminder that the mirror world is always near, always whispering. You rest in this awareness, and as you do, you sense the next step in the journey. For if antimatter exists, fleeting though it is, you may wonder where it hides, how it is created, how the universe produces it in secret flashes, and so your thoughts drift gently toward that question, toward the hidden places where antimatter is born and lost, and toward the next chapter, where you will follow its traces to the cosmos and the lab. You breathe slowly, letting your chest rise and fall like the tide, and as your breath steadies, you begin to follow the faint traces of antimatter, the ghostly twin of matter that appears not in the ordinary motions of daily life, but in rare and fleeting moments, hiding at the edges of the universe's great performance, whispering from shadows, shimmering into existence only to vanish again. And as you imagine this, you realize that antimatter is not absent from the world, but scattered, delicate, always near and always gone, like fireflies flickering in the night air. You picture the cosmos itself as a great stage where particles and forces move in endless dance. And in that dance, antimatter appears wherever energy is high, wherever collisions are fierce enough to create pairs, matter and antimatter springing together like twins born in the same instant, only to embrace and annihilate once more, leaving light behind as their echo. You drift first to the heavens, to the places where cosmic rays rain down upon Earth, streams of high-energy particles thrown out from supernovae, from pulsars, from violent places in the galaxy, and when these cosmic messengers strike our atmosphere, they shatter atoms into showers of fragments, and in those fragments, for the briefest moment positrons, the antimatter partners of electrons, flicker into being. You imagine these positrons darting downward through the air, sometimes caught by detectors on balloons or satellites, whispers of antimatter made by the very universe itself. And you feel awed how the cosmos continues to create and destroy these reflections every moment above your head. You let your mind wander further, beyond Earth, into the heart of stars where temperatures and pressures are so immense that particles collide with ferocity, and in these collisions, antimatter is born as well, positrons dancing within nuclear reactions, part of the fusion fires that light the night sky. You picture the sun, steady and gentle from afar, yet within its core, positrons are constantly made, constantly annihilated, their fleeting presence part of the star's heartbeat. And you realize that every ray of sunlight that warms your skin carries a memory of antimatter born and gone. You drift outward again to the galaxy's violent hearts, to pulsars spinning with unimaginable speed, their magnetic fields so strong they twist space itself, and in their magnetospheres, particles accelerate to near the speed of light, slamming into one another, producing showers of gamma rays and antimatter partners, antimatter flowing outward in winds invisible to your eyes, yet detectable as signatures of annihilation in the sky. You let yourself feel the scale of this, how the universe hides antimatter not in absence, but in constant, flickering presences, like sparks in a fire too large to comprehend. You think, too, of black holes, those deep wells of gravity, and of the regions around them where matter is crushed and heated as it falls inward, producing jets of particles that may include antimatter, twin streams flung across space at near light speed, shaping galaxies with their violence. And you see that even in the darkest places, antimatter hides, waiting in the chaos of energy. You breathe again, steady, and you return your thoughts closer to home, to laboratories where physicists coax antimatter into being with machines of precision and patience, particle accelerators that smash protons together at immense energies, releasing showers of particles, among them antiprotons and positrons, caught and studied before they vanish. And in these labs, humanity holds antimatter in magnetic bottles, keeping it from touching matter, keeping it suspended in vacuums, fragile. Droplets of mirrored existence kept for seconds, minutes, hours, as researchers study its nature, its behavior, its symmetry with matter, searching for secrets about why the universe contains so little of it compared to matter. You feel the tenderness of this effort, the fragility of holding lightning in your hands, knowing that even a single speck of dust touching the trapped antimatter would cause it to annihilate. Yet still humanity persists, building devices like the Penning Trap, where magnetic fields cradle antimatter, or the anti-hydrogen experiments at CERN, where entire atoms of antimatter, antiprotons orbited by positrons, are held long enough to measure, long enough to ask whether they fall in gravity the same way matter does, long enough to wonder whether their mirror symmetry is perfect or slightly broken. You realize that antimatter hides not only in the cosmos in a lab, but also, surprisingly, within you, for positrons are released in small amounts during processes in your own body, and in medicine, doctors use this appear inside you with PET scans, positron emission tomography, where a tracer emits positrons that annihilate with electrons, releasing gamma rays that form images of your living tissues. And you marvel that this most mysterious substance is already part of healing, part of life, not only a dream of rockets and stars. You let your thoughts soften into metaphor again, for antimatter is like a whisper balance that hides in plain sight, always created in pairs with matter, always vanishing in their embrace, a reminder that the universe is not only built of what endures, but also what flickers and fades, and you feel comfort in this, for it shows that even fleeting things have meaning, even what vanishes shapes the whole. You breathe deeper, and you begin to sense a connection to what comes next, for if antimatter hides in cosmic rays, in stars, in black holes, in labs, and even within your own body, then what happens when it no longer hides, when matter and antimatter meet fully and embrace an annihilation? That is the dance of light itself, the moment of perfect conversion, the place where fire is born from balance, and it waits gently for you in the next chapter. You breathe deeply, letting the air move through you like a tide, and as your breath steadies, you begin to sense a meeting, a convergence, the way two dancers approach one another across a stage, every step deliberate, every motion inevitable, for this is a dance of matter and antimatter, a choreography written not in music but in physics, an encounter so complete and so final that when the partners embrace, they vanish, leaving behind only light, only energy, only the afterglow of their union. And as you imagine this, you feel the strange beauty of it, for annihilation is not destruction in the sense of ruin, but transformation, a perfect conversion, a release of all that was contained, matter and antimatter meeting and giving themselves entirely to light. You picture an electron and its mirror twin, the positron, drifting toward one another, drawn not by romance but by physics. And when they touch, there is no remainder, no ash, no fragment. Both vanish, and in their place two photons leap outward, beams of light carrying the full energy of their mass, a fulfillment of Einstein's equation, E equals mc squared, the idea that mass is frozen energy, and in annihilation the freeze melts. The potential becomes real, and you are left with purity, with radiance. You let your imagination soften into metaphor. Two dancers bowing and dissolving into music, two ripples colliding and becoming a wave of light, two candles extinguished only to release a brighter flame. And you realize that annihilation is less a violent end than a surrender, a yielding to transformation, and that is what makes it so powerful, so alluring as an idea and as a source of energy. You think of how much fire is contained in even the smallest speck of matter. 1 gram of antimatter meeting 1 gram of matter would release energy equal to tens of thousands of tons of TNT, a fireball brighter than the sun, all from particles too small to see. And you begin to feel why antimatter is considered the most efficient fuel the universe allows, because nothing else gives so completely, nothing else transforms so totally. You breathe again, steady, and you realize that this efficiency is what makes antimatter rockets more than a fantasy, that to imagine harnessing annihilation is to imagine capturing the perfect fire, an engine that wastes nothing. You let yourself drift into the cosmic scale, imagining annihilation not in laboratories but in the sky, where positrons meet electrons in the heart of stars, where gamma rays burst outward from pulsars, where jets from black holes carry matter and antimatter in violent streams. And you see that this dance is already part of the universe, already woven into the light that fills your night. You think of the gamma ray flashes observed above thunderstorms, positrons created in lightning, annihilating with electrons to send out bursts of radiation, proof that even the storms of Earth hold this hidden ballet, this invisible choreography. You sense that annihilation is not rare but constant, happening everywhere, every moment, in the cosmos and in your body, in the tracers used in medical imaging, in the detectors of laboratories, in the high skies where cosmic rays collide. And though it is fleeting, it is real, and its light is part of the fabric of existence. You let your thoughts linger on the paradox. That annihilation, which seems like an end, is in fact the most luminous expression of being, that it turns what was solid into what is radiant, that it shows the hidden energy inside everything. You feel comfort in this, as though even endings can be beginnings, even loss can be light, and you see why scientists look to annihilation not only as a mystery, but as a promise that one day, harnessed carefully, it could become the engine that carries life across the stars. You imagine a rocket powered by this dance, antimatter and matter meeting in controlled chambers, their annihilation channeled into thrust, beams of plasma or photons streaming backward to drive the ship forward, and you picture the ship itself, gliding silently, its engines glowing not with fire but with light, a vessel carried by the most elegant dance in physics. You breathe into that vision, and you realize that to reach it, humanity must first measure the fire, must understand how much energy this dance truly holds, must compare it to fuels already known, to see just how vast the difference is. And so you feel the story turning softly, from the poetry of annihilation to the numbers that reveal its scale, the quiet arithmetic that shows why antimatter is unmatched, and you let yourself drift forward gently into that next chapter where the fire will be measured and its brilliance made clear. You breathe slowly, letting the breath expand within you and then flow outward. And as you rest in that rhythm, you begin to imagine the hidden energy contained in matter itself, a quiet potential waiting within every atom of your body, every grain of sand, every star above you. And you realize that the dream of antimatter rockets begins with a simple yet profound fact. Matter is energy, frozen, condensed, waiting, and when matter meets antimatter, that energy is released in its purest form. No waste, no remainder, only light and fire. And so the question becomes, how much? You picture a gram of sugar, a speck small enough to hold on your fingertip, and you imagine if that speck were paired with a gram of antimatter, the two would vanish in an instant, and in their place would burst forth an explosion equal to the detonation of a nuclear bomb, energy enough to flatten cities, energy equal tens of thousands of tons TNT. And yet it began with something so small, so ordinary, that you could have overlooked it. You let this vision soften, not to frighten but to remind you of scale, to show you why scientists see in antimatter the most efficient fuel of all. You breathe again, and as you exhale you recall other fuels, familiar ones, and you begin to compare. Chemical rockets, the engines that carried humans to the moon, burn hydrogen and oxygen, and they release about a few million joules of energy per kilogram, enough to push rockets upward, but so small compared to what is possible, like lighting a candle in comparison to the sun. Nuclear fission, the splitting of heavy atoms like uranium, releases far more, about 1,000,000 times more than chemical reactions, a furnace capable of powering cities and submarines, and nuclear fusion, the joining of light atoms like hydrogen into helium, releases even more, mirroring the fires of stars, promising vast reserve of energy if only it can be tamed. Yet even fusion is a step below the perfection of annihilation, for when matter and antimatter meet, 100% of their mass is turned into energy, nothing wasted, nothing left behind. You let the numbers flow gently. In chemical fuels, only a fraction of percent of mass becomes energy. In fission, less than 1%. In fusion, about 1%. But in annihilation, all of it, every bit of mass becomes light, becomes usable power. You imagine the difference as a series of lamps. The first glows faintly, the second burns brighter, the third dazzles, but the last fills the room with pure brilliance. No shadows left. You realize that this is why antimatter rockets gleam so brightly in imagination, why they seem like the ultimate vessel to carry life to the stars. You drift into another image, that of velocity. For the measure of a rocket is not only its energy but how fast it can go. And with chemical fuels, rockets strain to escape Earth, reaching a few kilometers per second. With fission or fusion, they could reach a fraction of light speed, perhaps 10%, enough to cross the distance to nearby stars in decades or centuries. But with antimatter, in principle, speeds much higher become possible. Even half the speed of light, journeys shortened to decades within a single human lifetime. You breathe into that thought, and as you do, you feel the comfort of possibility, the quiet reassurance that physics itself does not forbid these journeys, that the only barriers are practical, not fundamental. You let your mind drift to the laboratories where the numbers are tested, where a tiny amount of antimatter are created and measured, each positron, each antiproton confirming that the fire of annihilation releases exactly what the equations predict, no more, no less, consistent, reliable, the most perfect match between theory and reality. You think of the dreamers who sketch starships in quiet offices, calculating how many milligrams of antimatter will be needed to reach Mars in weeks instead of months, how many grams to reach Alpha Centauri in a century. And though the numbers are immense, though the costs today are beyond reach, the dream persists because the energy is real, the fire measurable, the potential undeniable. You breathe again, softly, and you imagine holding that energy not as a weapon but as a light, not as destruction but as motion, carrying a ship outward, carrying curiosity across the void. You realize that the challenge is not the physics, but the gentleness of control. For to use this fire is to store antimatter safely, to release it slowly, to channel annihilation into thrust. And this thought carries you naturally to the next step of the story, to the fragility of containment, to the question of how to hold lightning in a bottle, and you feel yourself drifting toward that problem with curiosity and calm. You breathe in deeply, then exhale slowly, and as you rest in that rhythm, you begin to imagine what it means to hold something that should not be held, to capture a flame that vanishes the moment it touches the world. For antimatter is unlike any other substance. It cannot rest in a container of metal or glass. It cannot be poured into a barrel or sealed into a tank, because the instant it meets ordinary matter it annihilates, releasing its hidden fire in a burst of energy. And so the question becomes, how you hold lightning, how you cradle reflection, how do you keep something safe that destroys everything it touches? You imagine scientists working in quiet laboratories, building traps of magnetic fields and vacuum chambers, delicate devices where nothing physical touches the antimatter, where instead invisible forces hold particles suspended in emptiness, like tiny fireflies glow in a jar made not glass, but of fields, unseen hands cradling fragile sparks. You picture a penning trap, a cylinder where electric and magnetic fields combine to guide charged particles, keeping positrons or antiprotons spinning in circles, never touching the walls, circling endlessly until they can be studied. And you see how even a single dust mote, a single collision with matter, would end their existence in a flash of light. You realize that these traps are like lullabies for lightning, gentle cradles where the antimatter is not imprisoned but balanced, floating between forces that cancel and protect, and you feel the delicacy of it, the patience it requires. For to keep antimatter is to master stillness, to keep the fields humming with precision, never faltering, never breaking rhythm. You drift into the image of antihydrogen, whole atoms of antimatter made by binding positrons to antiprotons, fragile mirrors of the simplest atom, hydrogen, and you imagine these atoms suspended in magnetic bottles at CERN, held for seconds, then minutes, then hours, each step a triumph of patience, proof that antimatter can be contained if handled with gentleness and care. You think of how rare these stores are, measured not in grams or even milligrams, but in atoms, in thousands or millions, still too little to fuel a rocket, but enough to prove that the dream is real, that antimatter can be cradled in the right kind of bottle. You feel the metaphor deepen, that to store antimatter is like holding a dream, fragile, fleeting, destroyed by the slightest disturbance, yet still worth the effort because of the promise it carries. You picture the challenges, the need for extreme vacuum so that no stray air molecule can touch the antimatter, the need for temperatures near absolute zero to keep particles still, the need for magnetic fields strong and steady enough to hold a charge. And you realize how intricate the dance is, how close to perfection the balance must be. You breathe again, slowly, And you see how scientists build these systems not only as experiments, but as acts of faith. Faith that one day containment will grow larger, more reliable, capable of holding not just atoms but grams, capable of storing enough to power a rocket across the stars. You think of the future designs. Massive magnetic bottles aboard starships, rings of superconducting coils surrounding reservoirs of antimatter plasma, fields humming like lullabies to hold the fuel in place, engines ready to release it in controlled streams, annihilation guided into thrust, fire made gentle enough to carry life outward. You sense the fragility of such a system, the risks of failure, the possibility of accidents, and yet you also sense the beauty, the elegance of solving such a problem, of turning annihilation into motion, danger into journey. You let your thoughts soften into metaphor again. Storing antimatter is like trying to hold the wind in your hands, like keeping reflection in a bottle, like balancing a flame upon a single thread. And yet, though it seems impossible, it is already being done in laboratories today, not at the scale of rockets, but at the scale of atoms, proof that the principle is real, that humanity is already learning to cradle lightning. You feel comfort in this, because it shows that impossible dreams often begin with fragile successes, with tiny steps, with patience, and from those seeds greater possibilities grow. You breathe again, calm and steady, and as you breathe you feel the story pulling forward. For if containment is possible, then what would it look like to use it? To build engines that burn with the fire of annihilation, to design rockets powered not by chemical flames but by light itself? That vision, shimmering just ahead, waits for you in the next chapter, where the imagination of antimatter rockets takes shape. You breathe slowly, and as you do, you begin to picture what it means to turn annihilation into motion, to take the quiet fire release when matter and antimatter meet and guide it, shape it, harness it, so that it does not explode chaotically but flows outward in steady streams, carrying a vessel across the silence of space. And in that vision you begin to see the outlines of an antimatter rocket. Not a roaring furnace like the chemical engines you know, but something subtler, stranger, an engine of light itself, glowing with the radiance of annihilation. You imagine a chamber the heart of a ship, where tiny amounts of antimatter are released into contact with ordinary matter, each meeting a dance of annihilation, each burst releasing photons and particles that rush outward, and instead of letting them scatter freely, the ship surrounds them with magnetic fields and nozzles, guiding the energy into a single direction backward, so that the ship itself moves forward, not with a thunder of combustion, but with the serene inevitability of Newton's third law. You picture different designs, each one a meditation on how to turn annihilation into thrust. In one, antimatter collides with matter to produce streams of high-energy particles, charged pions, that are caught in magnetic fields and directed out the back as exhaust, creating pure, powerful thrust. In another, antimatter annihilates to release energy that heats propellant, perhaps hydrogen, turning it into plasma that rushes outward like the breath of a star. In yet another, annihilation produces photons and mirrors or electromagnetic structures, channel them into beams of light that push the ship forward, a photon rocket glowing like a star carried in your hands. You let these visions drift one by one, feeling how each is both elegant and fragile, each demanding containment, precision, patience. You realize that antimatter rockets are not engines in the familiar sense, not machines with gears and pistons, but rather orchestrations of physics, symphonies of particles, each note tuned by fields and chambers so that annihilation becomes motion. You breathe again and you sense the scale of possibility. Chemical rockets can carry humans to the moon. Nuclear thermal rockets might carry them to Mars. Fusion engines could perhaps reach the outer planets, but antimatter, with its unmatched efficiency, could take a starship to another star, shrinking distances that today seem endless into journeys within human time. You imagine a voyage to Alpha Centauri, our nearest neighbor star, for light years away, unreachable with current engines, but perhaps within decades with antimatter propulsion, the ship accelerating for years, coasting at a fraction of light speed, then slowing again, carried entirely by the quiet fire of annihilation. You picture the ship gliding silently through interstellar space, its wake not a trail of smoke, but a stream of charged particles glowing faintly, its engine humming not with sound but with light, a vessel riding the most elegant energy the universe allows. You let your thoughts linger on the balance. To use antimatter rockets is to walk a line between beauty and danger, between elegance and catastrophe. For every gram of antimatter is a sun trapped in a bottle. Every release must be exact. Every system must hold. And yet that very delicacy gives a vision its poetry, for the ship itself becomes a meditation on precision, on patience, on harmony with the laws of nature. You think of how such a ship would appear from afar, a faint glimmer moving through the dark, not bright like a star but steady, a candle flame carried into the cosmic night, and you feel the comfort of that image, the gentleness of travel powered not by violence but by balance, annihilation channeled into motion, destruction turned into journey. You let yourself imagine standing within such a ship, feeling no roar, no shaking, only a constant steady push, a quiet acceleration so gentle you might not notice at first, but over weeks and months it builds, carrying you faster than any rocket before, until stars themselves seem to shift, their positions bending under the subtle effect of relativity. And in that silence you feel awe, not at speed alone, but at the partnership between human curiosity and the universe's deepest laws. You breathe again, slow and steady, and as you breathe you feel the story bending towards shadow, for with fire so great there must also be risks, with power so absolute there must be dangers, and you sense that the dream of antimatter rockets is never separate from the fear of loss, the fragility of containment, the shadows of safety that surround every step forward, and so you find yourself drifting softly toward the next chapter where those shadows are explored, where the risks of fire and void are faced gently, so the dream can endure. You breathe in slowly, and as the air fills your lungs you begin to feel the weight of fragility, the sense that every dream, no matter how dazzling, casts a shadow, and when you dream of antimatter rockets, you must also dream of their dangers, for antimatter is the most volatile partner imaginable, a fire that cannot be touched, a mirror that vanishes the moment it meets its twin, and though it promises journeys to the stars, it also carries risks that whisper through every thought of containment, storage, and use, reminding you that to hold antimatter is to walk always at the edge of fire and void. You picture a single gram of antimatter, less than the weight of a paperclip, and yet enough, if released at once, to unleash an explosion equal to tens of thousands of tons of TNT, enough to level a city, enough to carve scars into Earth itself. And you realize that the very efficiency that makes antimatter so alluring also makes it dangerous, because unlike chemical fuels or even nuclear fuels, there is no gentleness in annihilation, no slow burn, only total transformation, and so the art of using it lies entirely in control and precision, in patience that never falters. You imagine a starship carrying antimatter in magnetic bottles, rings of superconducting coils humming constantly to hold particles suspended in vacuum, and you realize that every coil must remain cold, every field must remain stable, every system must remain unbroken, for a single failure, a single flicker of disruption, could release the stored fire in a single breath, turning the vessel into light. You think of the void of space, harsh and indifferent, where radiation strikes, where micrometeorites pierce hulls, where magnetic storms wash over from stars, and you realize that all of these could threaten containment. All of these could shake the fragile bottles of antimatter. You breathe again, slowly, letting the thoughts settle, not as fear but as clarity, for acknowledging risk is part of honoring the dream. You imagine engineers debating designs, speaking in quiet voices about redundancy, about layers of containment, about storing antimatter not in one chamber but in many, scattered across a ship, so that a single failure does not destroy the whole, about using magnetic fields that can collapse antimatter harmlessly into space if failure looms, about building vessels not as fortresses but as gardens of balance, where safety grows from care rather than from denial. You drift into the history of human technology and remember that every great step has carried risk. Fire burned homes before it cooked meals. Ships sank before they mapped oceans. Airplanes fell before they carried passengers, and rockets themselves exploded before they reached the stars. And yet humanity persisted, learned, refined, until the danger was balanced by understanding, and you feel comfort in this, knowing that even antimatter, as perilous as it seems, may one day be tamed by the same patience. You let your mind wander further, into the philosophical shadow. The fear not of engines but of intentions. For antimatter's power makes it not only a dream for rockets, but a temptation for weapons. Annihilation harnessed not for travel but for destruction. And you sense how fragile the line is between wonder and fear, between exploration and violence. And you realize that the shadows of safety are not only technical but also moral, asking not only can we, but should we, not only how to build, but how to choose. You breathe into that awareness, gently, and you remind yourself that every technology carries such choices, that the same fire that can burn fields can also warm homes, the same atom that can split in bombs can also power hospitals. And so it will be with antimatter, a tool waiting for the hands that will shape its use. You let this awareness soften into metaphor. Carrying antimatter is like carrying a star in a lantern, beautiful but blinding, fragile but powerful, a gift that requires reverence, not arrogance. You picture the starship again, gliding silently, its engines glowing with annihilation turned into motion, and you imagine the crew not as conquerors of fire, but as stewards, caretakers of a power far greater than themselves, living each day with awareness of the balance they maintain. You feel that in the shadow lies also serenity, for to acknowledge danger is to walk carefully, and to walk carefully is to walk wisely. You rest in this thought, and as you rest, you sense that the dream of antimatter rockets persists not because it ignores the shadows, but because it accepts them, because in accepting them becomes stronger, more grounded, more real. You breathe once more, steady and calm, and as you breathe, you begin to feel the pull toward the next question. For the dangers are so many. What is it we can do now? What steps are possible today? What beginnings can be made in laboratories and experiments, not in distant futures, but in this present moment, where the first seeds of antimatter propulsion are already being planted? And so you drift softly toward the next chapter, where the impossible becomes incremental, where small steps begin to lead the way. You breathe in slowly, letting the air fill your body like calm water filling a vessel. And as you exhale, you begin to feel how even the most impossible dreams are not leapt into all at once, but are approached step by step, softly, patiently, each step a stone laid across the river of impossibility. And so it is with antimatter rockets. For though the image of starships crossing the dark on beams of annihilation feels distant, unreachable, perhaps even mythical, the truth is that the first steps are already here, small but real, built not in secret hangars or science fiction novels, but in laboratories where physicists bend their attention to the smallest fragments of the universe, coaxing antimatter into being, holding it for a moment at a time, learning from it slowly, as if taming a wild and fragile creature that vanishes at the slightest touch. You imagine CERN, the great laboratory beneath the soil of Europe, where protons are smashed together at near light speed, and in the chaos of those collisions, antimatter appears, antiprotons, positrons, born from the violence of energy, fleeting but measurable, and here they are caught in magnetic traps, studied in detail, weighed, compared to their matter twins with exquisite precision. And through these experiments, humanity has already confirmed that antimatter is real, symmetrical, a mirror that obeys the same laws, and that it can be created in small but significant amounts. You picture the penning traps, magnetic bottles no larger than your hand, inside of which hover clouds of antiprotons or positrons, suspended in emptiness, so they never touch the matter walls, glowing invisibly, kept alive for seconds, then minutes, then hours, proof that containment is possible. You let your imagination wander into the Alpha experiment at CERN, where whole atoms of antihydrogen, antiprotons orbited by positrons, have been created and held, trapped in magnetic fields, studied for spectra, their behavior, their subtle differences, or lack thereof with hydrogen. And you realize that this is not fiction but fact, that antimatter can be made, stored, and measured today, not in grams or kilograms, but in atoms, a handful of whispers that already change the way you think a possibility. You breathe deeper, sensing how delicate these achievements are, how expensive, how rare, yet how they represent the first real seed of antimatter use, seeds that could one day grow into the trees of propulsion. You drift into the realm of medicine, remembering that positrons, antimatter electrons, are already part of healing, used in PET scans where they are emitted from tracers, annihilated with electrons in the body, releasing photons that are captured to make images of living tissues, allowing doctors to see what is hidden, and you feel a quiet amazement that antimatter, so exotic, so dangerous, already rests in hospitals, already touches lives gently, already participates in care, not destruction. You let your thoughts follow the lines of research into space itself. For satellites have detected positrons in the Van Allen belt around Earth, antimatter trapped naturally by our magnetic field. Reminder that even the planet cradles this strange mirror, and though we cannot yet harvest it, the vision of doing so whispers of future possibilities, collecting natural antimatter from planetary magnetospheres to fuel rockets, gathering what the universe itself provides. You imagine small experiments proposed by space agencies, tiny spacecraft carrying magnetic scoops, designed to skim the upper layers of trapped positrons around Earth or Jupiter, storing them in miniature bottles. Not enough for starships, but enough to prove the principle, enough to begin. You realize that every one of these steps is modest, fragile, incomplete, and yet every one is also real, grounding the dream in practice, reminding you that impossible journeys always begin with a single small movement. You breathe again, steady and slow, and you think of cost. For antimatter today is the most expensive material ever made, billions of dollars for even fractions of a gram, far beyond practicality. Yet even this does not dim the dream, for history is filled with impossibilities that became ordinary once methods improved, aluminum once precious as silver, flight once absurd, electricity once useless, and so, too, with patience might antimatter become. You let this comfort settle, that impossibility is not permanent, that it softens under persistence. You think of the students and scientists working quietly now, designing magnetic fields, testing cryogenic systems, measuring lifetimes of trapped particles, and you feel the humanity of it, the patience of minds and hands building the future not with leaps but with care. You rest in this awareness, and as you rest you feel the next question arise. If antimatter can be created, stored, and used in atoms and milligrams today, what would it take to scale this dream? What would it cost to fuel a starship? What economics and effort would be required to turn whispers into voyages? That question waits gently ahead, and you drift toward it, into the next chapter, where the dream is weighed not in energy but in value, in cost, in the price of starlight itself. You breathe slowly, letting your chest rise and fall with ease, and as you do, you begin to feel the shape of a question that lies like a shadow beneath the brilliance of antimatter. If this fire is real, if it can be made and stored, then what is its cost? What price must be paid to carry even a gram of starlight in a bottle? And how heavy is the weight of such a dream upon the shoulders of humanity? You imagine laboratories today, where particle accelerators hum with energy, where protons are flung at near light speed into collisions, and in the debris of those collisions, antimatter is born, positrons, antiprotons, each particle like a spark flickering for a moment before vanishing, each one precious, each one expensive beyond measure, because the machines themselves consume immense power, and the processes yield only traces, perhaps a few nanograms after years of effort, and so the cost of antimatter today is measured not in dollars per gram, but in billions per gram, a figure so immense it feels almost absurd, as though trying to purchase a star. You picture a gram of gold, easy to hold, or a gram of diamonds, valuable but attainable, and then you imagine a gram of antimatter, a cost so great it could fund nations. And you realize that this is why antimatter rockets remain a dream, because though the physics is real, the economics is daunting. You breathe again, slow and steady, and you think of how this cost reflects not impossibility, but inefficiency, because current methods of production are not designed to make antimatter as fuel, but only as a tool for research. And just as aluminum was once more valuable than silver until new methods made it common, so too might antimatter one day move from priceless rarity to manageable resource. You imagine vast solar-powered accelerators orbiting in space, their rings bathed in sunlight, designed not to probe the mysteries of physics, but to manufacture antimatter deliberately, factories of annihilation's twin, producing micrograms each year, storing them in magnetic bottles, waiting for use, and you feel the possibility unfold. Expensive still, but no longer unreachable. You drift further into the metaphor of stardust, for antimatter is not mined or gathered but created, sculpted from energy itself. Each particle like a jewel carved from the collision of light, and so to gather enough to fuel a starship is to commit to effort measured not in weeks or years, but in generations, to accept that the price of reaching the stars may not be counted only in money, but in patience, in devotion, in the willingness of humanity to invest in something whose reward is distant, but profound. You think, too, of the economics beyond money, the value of inspiration, the weight of knowledge, the worth of dreams. For build the tools to make antimatter at scale is also to deepen understanding of physics, to advance technology in magnets, superconductors, cryogenics, energy systems, and each of these advances would ripple outward into medicine, industry, daily life, returns not measured in dollars but in possibilities. You breathe into this thought, feeling comfort in the knowledge that even expensive dreams can nourish the present. You let your mind wander to the balance sheet of risk and reward. The risk of investing in something that may take centuries to fulfill, the reward of journeys that might open the stars, and you realize that the cost of antimatter is not only economic but philosophical, asking whether humanity dares to plant trees whose shade may never be seen, whether we are willing to invest in journeys that will not return profit quickly but will reshape destiny. You let this question soften, not to be answered now, but to linger as an invitation, and you realize that even if the cost of antimatter remains immense, there are paths forward, stepping stones of other technologies, nuclear fission and fusion rockets, methods that can carry us further even before antimatter becomes practical, and by walking those paths we may prepare ourselves for a day when the economics shift. You breathe once more, and you see that the dream remains, not because it's affordable but because it is beautiful, and beauty often inspires persistence even when cost is high. You feel the chapter begin to close, and as it does, you sense the next step, to compare antimatter rockets not in isolation but alongside fission and fusion, to see what lessons they offer, what bridges they provide, and so you drift softly into the next chapter, where the fires of atoms, split and joined, reveal their guidance to the greater dream. You breathe softly, letting your body rest in stillness, and as you do, you begin to sense how every great dream is built upon foundations already laid, each step toward the stars resting on lessons learned from smaller fires. And in the story Propulsion, those smaller fires are not small at all, but immense. The splitting of atoms and fission, the joining of atoms and fusion, processes that humanity has already touched, already harnessed in ways both terrible and inspiring, and these processes offer not only energy but guidance, showing what is possible, what is dangerous, and what is required for the still greater fire of antimatter. You imagine fission first, the splitting of heavy nuclei like uranium or plutonium, atoms so large that when struck by a neutron they shatter into smaller pieces, releasing energy and more neutrons that can strike again, a chain reaction unfolding like a row of falling dominoes, each fall releasing warmth, light, and motion. You recall how fission was discovered not long ago, in the anxious years of the 20th century, and how quickly its potential was turned into weapons of destruction, bombs that burned cities into memory, showing at once the immensity of atomic fire and the peril of wielding it without restraint. Yet fission is also the power behind nuclear reactors, behind submarines that roam the oceans for years without refueling, behind satellites and spacecraft that sip energy from reactors, proving that controlled fission can be a partner to progress. You realize that fission rockets were even tested decades ago, nuclear thermal engines that heated hydrogen with atomic fire, expelling it in jets of plasma, offering thrust more efficient than chemical engines, and though they were never launched beyond tests, the principle remains sound, a reminder that atomic fire has already been brought close to propulsion. You breathe deeper, and you turn to fusion, the joining of light nuclei like hydrogen into helium, the process that fuels the sun, the furnace of every star, the source of nearly all warmth and light on Earth. Fusion has long been humanity's dream, because it promises vast energy with minimal waste, a fire that produces no long-lived poisons, a fire that draws from water itself, a fire so abundant it could light civilizations for millennia. You imagine the sun, its core pressing hydrogen into helium in endless chains, releasing photons that take thousands of years to reach the surface, and then only minutes to travel across space to warm your skin. And you realize that to harness fusion is to capture the same process that makes the stars themselves shine. Humanity has pursued this dream for decades, building magnetic bottles called tokamaks, laser-driven implosions, stellarators that twist plasma into loops, all in the hope of holding the sun's fire here on Earth. And though the dream is not yet fulfilled, every step teaches patience. Every experiment reveals more about the art containing the uncontainable. You feel how fission and fusion together form a path. Fission, already practical, already used in reactors and experiments with propulsion. Fusion, still reaching, still not yet tamed but full of promise. And you see that antimatter lies at the far end of this path, the most efficient fire of all, but a fire that demands mastery of everything learned before, the balance of containment, the patience of engineering, the humility of restraint. You let yourself drift into comparison. Chemical fuels give energy like the flicker of a candle, fission like the blaze of a furnace, fusion like the steady brilliance of the sun, and antimatter like the instantaneous flash of pure light, each step more efficient, each step harder to control, each step requiring lessons from the last. You realize that antimatter rockets will not appear suddenly, leaping past the steps of fission and fusion, but will grow from them, their designs informed by what it means to store dangerous materials, to guide plasma, to hold extreme heat, to prevent accidents, to balance risk and reward. You breathe again, steady, and you remember that humanity already knows the double nature of nuclear fire, its promise and its peril, and those lessons must be carried forward, for antimatter too will hold both, able to carry life to the stars or to unleash destruction. You let your thoughts soften into metaphor. Fission is like breaking a boulder into pieces and releasing its weight. Fusion is like pressing droplets into a pearl and releasing its glow. Antimatter is like two perfect mirrors touching and vanishing into light, and together they form a lineage, each one teaching how to handle the next. You rest in that awareness, comforted by the knowledge that progress does not leap but walks, that each step prepares the way for the next, and as you rest you sense the story shifting again. For if fission and fusion teach us the principles, then the real promise of antimatter lies not only in engines, but in journeys, in what could be reached if such fire were mastered. And so your thoughts drift forward into the next chapter, where oceans of vacuum give way to visions of interstellar travel, where antimatter rockets whisper crossing beyond the solar wind into the long night between stars. You breathe deeply, and as the breath fills you, you imagine yourself floating at the edge of the solar system, where the protective bubble of the sun's influence fades, where the solar wind weakens and gives way to the deeper winds of the galaxy, and you begin to sense the immensity of distance, the silence that lies between stars, a silence so vast that even light takes years to cross it, and yet here you are, carried by thought, by dream, by the vision of ships that might one day travel on. The fire of antimatter, crossing the darkness not with the slowness of chemical rockets, but with steady speed, journeys that make the unreachable reachable. You picture a ship leaving Earth, its engines glowing softly, powered not by burning fuel, but by the annihilation of matter and antimatter, each meeting releasing pure energy, each burst channeled into thrust, and though the acceleration is gentle, almost unnoticeable, over months and years it builds, carrying the vessel to a fraction of light speed, until familiar planets fall behind. The sun itself shrinks to a bright star, and the ship slips beyond the solar wind into interstellar space. You imagine the feeling of such a journey. No roar, no turbulence, only a constant, steady push, a hum of systems, a glow of engines, a silence broken only by voices within and beyond the hull, the vastness of the galaxy, endless, calm, infinite. You drift into the scale of it, knowing that the nearest star, Alpha Centauri, lies 4 light years away, unreachable by today's ships that would take tens of thousands of years, but perhaps within a human lifetime if antimatter rockets could sustain speeds of 10 or 20% of light, decades of travel instead of millennia, journeys not generations upon generations, but of those who left returning within their own age. You feel the weight of such possibility, the way it changes perspective, making interstellar travel not only a story of imagination, but of physics, of engineering, of dreams that might one day find form. You picture the stars as destinations. Proxima Centauri with its small red glow and its orbiting planets, perhaps world with atmospheres, perhaps oceans. Barnard Star, ancient and steady. The TRAPPIST system with its 7 planets dancing close together like pearls on a string, each one a lighthouse in the night, beckoning across distances immense but no longer impossible. You let yourself imagine the voyage itself, the long years spent in transit, the ship a world in miniature, with gardens of hydroponic green, with water recycled endlessly, with crew moving to the rhythm of days and nights marked not by sun or moon, but by the turning of lights within and outside, the endless stars sliding slowly as the vessel moves. You think of the psychological journey, the calm required to travel decades through silence, the strength to see Earth as a memory and a star ahead as hope, and you realize that antimatter rockets are not only about propulsion, but about patience. Not only about physics, but about the endurance of human spirit. You breathe again, steady and slow, and you imagine how each annihilation event inside the engine is itself a kind of echo of creation, matter and antimatter meeting as they did in the earliest universe, releasing light, pushing the ship forward, making each step of the journey a reenactment of cosmic birth. You let that awareness comfort you, for it means a voyage is not apart from the universe, but part of it. Each thrust a continuation of ancient rhythms. You drift further, thinking of what such journeys would mean. New maps drawn across the stars, new horizons opened, new questions asked, and perhaps answers found about whether life exists elsewhere, whether the dream of connection is more than hope. You sense that interstellar travel would not be only about exploration, but about perspective, about realizing that Earth is not the center, but one world among many, precious but not alone. You rest in that vision, letting it soothe you, and as you rest, you begin to sense the next question. For while antimatter rockets make interstellar travel imaginable, they are still bound by physics, by limits, by laws that cannot be broken. And so you feel the story turning toward those limits, toward the boundaries set by relativity and energy, and you drift gently into the next chapter where the whispers of physics remind you what is possible and what is not. You breathe softly, feeling the rise and fall of your chest like the steady swell of an ocean. And as you do, you begin to hear in imagination the whispers of physics, the subtle reminders that the universe, though vast and generous, has boundaries, that every dream of speed, every dream of travel, must unfold within the laws that govern all things. And in these whispers lies not discouragement but guidance, like the gentle hand of a teacher, reminding you of what is possible and what is not, showing you the shape of the path without closing it. You imagine a starship powered by antimatter, accelerating ever faster, and you picture the limit set by Einstein's relativity, the truth that no mass can ever reach or exceed the speed of light, because as velocity grows, so too does the energy required, rising not steadily but steeply, until near light speed the demand becomes infinite, and so the ship may approach light, but never touch it, always carried forward, but never breaking the cosmic barrier. You let that truth settle gently, not as a wall, but as a horizon, for though you cannot cross it, you can still move nearer and nearer, perhaps to a tenth of light speed, perhaps to a fifth, even a half, speeds that would make the stars within reach of human generations, and in those fractions lies possibility. Journeys shortened from millennia to decades, distances softened by patience and persistence. You breathe again, steady, and you think of time itself, how relativity also whispers that as you near light speed, time aboard the ship slows compared to time outside, so that for travelers, years may pass while for those left behind, decades unfold, and you realize that this too is a kind of gift, a reminder that journeys to the stars would not only be physical but temporal, shaping how you experience life, how you mark your own story against the universe. You let your imagination drift further, to the nature of annihilation itself, to the particles born when matter and antimatter vanish, to the gamma rays and pions. The photons carry momentum, and you realize that engines must manage not only energy but radiation, must turn dangerous streams into useful thrust. And so physics whispers again. This fire is powerful, but it must be guided, shielded, balanced, for the same photons that carry you forward can also harm. You think of efficiency, of how every rocket must obey the rocket equation, the truth that to reach greater speeds requires more fuel not linearly but exponentially, and you see how antimatter helps by packing the greatest energy into the smallest mass. Yet still, the equation stands, still, mass must be carried, still, balance must be kept, and you realize that physics does not bend but offers tools, reminders of what designs must respect. You breathe into this, letting it soothe you rather than discourage you, for these limits give shape to dreams, making them real instead of fantasy, grounding them in law instead of wish. You imagine the vast distances of stars, measured not only in light years but in energy budgets, in fuel required, in patience demanded, and you sense the humility of interstellar travel, the way it teaches reverence for scale, the way it slows the mind into acceptance. You think, too, of possibilities within limits, of sails pushed by photons, of fields shaping plasma, of antimatter engines working in concert with other ideas, and you feel how physics leaves doors open, how within its laws there are many paths. You let your thoughts soften into metaphor, Physics is a riverbank guiding the current, not stopping it but giving it form. Physics is a grain in which shaping how it can be carved. Physics is a whisper of the universe saying, go this way, not that. You rest in this, comforted, and as you rest you sense the next step. For the limits are known, then the details of design begin. The invisible tools that might guide a ship's exhaust, the magnetic fields and plasma winds that act as the silent partners of antimatter engines. And so you drift gently forward, into the next chapter where those unseen hands take shape. You breathe slowly, letting your lungs expand and then soften. And as you do, you begin to feel the unseen presence of forces that surround you always but are seldom noticed, forces without weight or color, forces that move silently yet shape everything you know. And in the vision of antimatter rockets, these forces are not side characters, but central. The invisible partners that would make annihilation into motion, the guides that would shape raw energy into thrust, the hands that cradle plasma and light, and those partners are magnetic fields and plasma winds. You imagine the annihilation of matter and antimatter inside the chamber of a ship, particles bursting forth at near the speed of light, charged pions and gamma rays scattering outward in every direction, and you realize that without guidance, such energy would be chaotic, destructive, unusable. But with a touch of magnetic fields, those charged particles can be caught, bent, directed, shaped into a focused exhaust that pushes the ship forward, and you begin to see how invisible lines of force become as real as metal walls, how fields act like rivers guiding currents of particles, how the unseen becomes the architecture of motion. You picture coils of superconducting magnets wound around the engine, humming with current, creating fields strong enough to shape the most energetic particles, and you sense how delicate the balance must be. Fields tuned precisely to guide streams of plasma, to turn annihilation from chaos into thrust, each field like a hand cupping light. You drift into the nature of plasma itself, that strange fourth state of matter, neither solid, liquid, nor gas, but sea of charged particles, a wind of ions and electrons that flows like water but responds to magnetic fields like iron filings. And you realize that an antimatter engine would in truth be a sculptor of plasma, shaping it with fields into a jet, into a stream, into a controlled breath of fire. You imagine the plasma exhaust glowing behind the ship, not roaring like chemical flames, but shimmering, radiant, a tail of light stretching into the darkness, silent but full of power. You think of Earth's own magnetic field, the invisible shield that protects you from cosmic winds, bending streams of charged particles from the sun, painting auroras across the poles, and you realize that the same principle that makes the northern lights dance could one day guide the exhaust of a starship, turning destruction into beauty, danger into propulsion. You breathe again, calm and steady, and you sense how fields are not only tools of containment, but also of safety, for antimatter must never touch matter except where intended, and so magnetic fields must cradle it before annihilation, keep it suspended in vacuum, guide it into controlled contact, never letting it drift, never letting it touch where it should not. And you begin to see the ship itself as less a machine of steel and more a symphony of fields, magnetic lines, and plasma winds, humming in harmony, shaping fire into forward motion. You drift further, imagining the engineering of such a system. Coils cooled to near absolute zero so they can conduct without resistance, magnets strong enough to bend particles born of annihilation, shields to protect the crew from radiation, channels to guide plasma smoothly outward. And you realize that the challenge is immense but not impossible, because already on Earth humanity has built machines that sculpt plasma in fusion reactors, in accelerators, in laboratories where scientists hold miniature suns inside magnetic bottles. And these same principles could one day expand into the engines of antimatter ships. You let yourself soften into metaphor. Magnetic fields as invisible fingers combing the hair of plasma, smoothing its chaos into order. Plasma winds as the breath of the ship, exhaled steadily into the dark. Annihilation as the heart. Fields as the hands, plasma as the voice. And together they form a body of motion, a vessel alive in its balance. You rest in that vision, feeling comfort in knowing that invisible things, though unseen, can be real and strong. That guidance does not always need to be visible to be trusted. You breathe once more, steady, and as you exhale, you sense the story beginning to shift again, for fields and plasma guide the engines. Then the ship is ready to carry people, and with people come new questions, not of physics alone, but of humanity, of what it means to ride annihilation into the dark, of what the journey feels like inside. And so you find yourself drifting gently toward the next chapter where the human factor enters the story, where travelers themselves become part of the dream. You breathe deeply, and as your lungs fill and empty, you imagine yourself stepping aboard a vessel unlike any you have known, a ship not built across oceans or circle planets, but adrift across the dark between stars, powered by engines that hum with the fire of annihilation. And as you take that step, you begin to sense that the greatest element of this journey is not only the physics or the engineering, but the people who will live within these walls, the travelers themselves, human beings, carried far from the familiar warmth of Earth into a silence so immense that even time feels different, and you begin to feel how such a journey is both physical and emotional, both technical and spiritual. You imagine the first days after departure, Earth still visible as a bright marble behind, its blues and greens shimmering in sunlight, and you sense the ache of leaving, the way the heart must stretch as distance grows, knowing that every kilometer adds to the separation from home, and yet within that ache there is awe, the wonder of seeing the whole planet at once, of knowing you are part of a mission larger than yourself, a mission to carry life farther than it has ever gone. You picture the hum of the ship, constant but gentle, systems recycling air, purifying water, growing food in hydroponic gardens, light shifting to mark artificial days and nights, and you realize that life aboard such a ship will be a rhythm, a pattern repeated day after day, work and rest, maintenance and reflection, a slow unfolding of time in which patience is the greatest skill. You let your imagination drift into the psychology of such travel, how the crew must learn to live with silence, how they must learn to live with each other, how every voice, every gesture, every relationship becomes magnified by the closeness of confinement and the immensity of isolation, and you realize that antimatter rockets do not solve the human challenge of distance. They only make it possible. And so the mind must adapt. The spirit must grow. You think of the windows of the ship, showing stars ahead and behind, unchanged for months, for years, a sky that shifts only slowly as the vessel crosses light years, and you sense how perspective would deepen, how the meaning of time itself would change, days measured not by sunsets, but by tasks, by maintenance cycles, by conversations, by inner reflections. You breathe again, steady, and you imagine the comfort routine, tending plants, exercise and keep muscles strong in weightlessness, reading, writing, watching Earth shrink into memory, watching the destination star grow brighter across decades. You let yourself imagine the effects of relativity, time dilation making years aboard feel different from years on Earth, so that those who left might return to find generations past, their own time slower compared to home they left, and you sense the bittersweetness of that truth, the gift of traveling farther than any before, balanced by the cost of leaving the familiar flow of family and history. You drift into the metaphors of such a journey. The ship is a monastery, a place of quiet reflection. The ship is a garden, carrying green life into the void. The ship is a cradle, holding fragile beings in safety as they cross the cold. And above all, the ship is a story written not in chapters of years, but in breaths, in steps, in steady persistence. You think of how conversations aboard would change, how the meaning of hope would shift, how patience would become not only a virtue but a necessity, and you feel how such journeys would reshape what it means to be human, stretching imagination, deepening empathy, teaching that life is not only about arrival but about the long and gentle motion of travel itself. You rest in this awareness, letting it comfort you, and as you rest you begin to sense that the human factor is not only about the travelers themselves but also about the universe they inhabit, for the cosmos is not empty but alive with forces, with echoes, with phenomena that shape the journey, and some of those are bound to antimatter itself, natural processes that whisper of its presence, gamma rays and bursts and jets that light the galaxy with energy, and so your thoughts drift softly toward the next chapter, where the story widens again, from the people aboard the ship to the cosmos around them, to the places where antimatter already dances in nature, waiting to be understood. You breathe deeply, and as your lungs fill and release, you begin to imagine the universe not as silent emptiness, but as a living stage where particles dance, collide, vanish, and reappear, and among them, always fleeting, always luminous, is antimatter, woven not by human hands, but by nature itself, appearing in places of power, hiding in flashes of light, reminding you that this mirror substance is not an invention of science fiction, but reality already written into the cosmos, waiting to be noticed. You picture the heart of the sun, where hydrogen atoms press together under immense heat and pressure, fusing into helium, and in that process positrons are born, antimatter twins of electrons, rushing outward through the dense solar plasma, annihilated with electrons and releasing photons that will eventually, after countless collisions and delays, escape as sunlight. And you realize that every ray of warmth touching your skin carries within it the memory of antimatter's birth and annihilation. That antimatter is part of the sunlight that nourishes forests, warms oceans, and sustains you. You drift outward to the vast galaxy, to the whirling remnants of exploded stars, supernovae whose shock waves accelerate particles to near light speed, cosmic rays that travel for millions of years before striking Earth's atmosphere, and in those collisions new showers of antimatter are born, positrons and antiprotons flickering into existence, annihilating again in cascades of light. And some of these particles are caught by satellites orbiting Earth, measured as faint traces of annihilation, that prove antimatter is part of the cosmic rain that falls upon the planet every day. You let your thoughts wander further, to pulsars, collapsed stars spinning faster than a kitchen blender, their magnetic fields so fierce they whip particles into beams of radiation, and in those beams, positrons stream outward in endless floods, carried into space like whispers from the corpses of stars, making antimatter not rare but abundant in the right conditions. You imagine black holes, those deep wells of gravity, surrounded by swirling disks of gas so hot that matter and light are torn apart. In the chaos of these accretion disks, particles are smashed into one another, creating both matter and antimatter, some annihilating immediately, others swept into jets that shoot for thousands of light years, carrying antimatter into galaxy in streams of near-light speed fire. You feel awe at this, the thought that nature itself builds engines far more powerful than anything humanity could imagine, engines that naturally produce the very substance dreamed of for star travel. You breathe again, steady and calm, and you turn your thoughts closer to home, to Earth's thunderstorms, where lightning bolts crackle through the sky and in their violence produce positrons, bursts of antimatter that shoot upward into space, detected as flashes of gamma rays, proof that even a storm outside your window can birth antimatter in its sudden fire. You marvel at this, that something so exotic is also so ordinary, happening above you every summer night, hidden in the clouds, unremarked but real. You think, too, of the Van Allen belts, Earth's magnetic shield, where cosmic rays and solar wind collide, and their positrons become trapped, circling the planet, creating a reservoir of natural antimatter, tiny but measurable, waiting in the sky above. You realize that the cosmos is filled with antimatter's echoes, from the smallest storms to the largest galaxies, and you feel comfort in this, because it means antimatter is not alien but natural, part of the same universe that gave you breath. You let yourself drift into metaphor, antimatter as a ghost, always near but never lingering, antimatter as the echo of creation, reminding you of the symmetry for which the universe was born, antimatter as a secret thread in sunlight, in lightning and auroras. You breathe slowly, and as you do, you sense the next turn in the story. For if antimatter exists everywhere, if it is already part of the cosmos, then perhaps it is not only a dream but a destiny. And so the next question becomes, how will humanity move from these natural whispers to building engines, to carrying fuel, to turning possibility into future? That vision waits ahead, and you drift softly toward the next chapter, where the fire of tomorrow is imagined step by step, from laboratories to starships. You breathe slowly, letting your body soften into stillness. And as you do, you begin to picture a bridge stretching from the present moment into the centuries ahead, a bridge made not of stone or steel, but of patience, invention, and quiet persistence. For the dream of antimatter rockets cannot leap fully formed from imagination into reality. It must grow step by step, each advance like a single plank laid across the gulf between now and the stars. And as you rest in this thought, you begin to see how the fire tomorrow might unfold, how the tiny sparks of antimatter made in laboratories today could one day become the engines of interstellar ships. You imagine the present, particle accelerators producing only nanograms of antimatter, held in traps for hours, study for their symmetry, their behavior, their gentle whispers of physics. And though the amounts are small, each atom is a promise, each experiment a seed, and from these seeds new technologies will grow, better magnetic bottles, more efficient accelerators, methods of harvesting positrons from natural reservoirs around Earth, techniques for converting sunlight or fusion power into antimatter production, and you realize that the first true step will be not to build starships, but to learn to create and store antimatter in practical amounts, perhaps micrograms, perhaps milligrams, enough not to power journeys, but to test propulsion, to prove that annihilation can be channeled into thrust. You let your thoughts drift forward to the first demonstration engines, perhaps small satellites launched into orbit with tiny stores of antimatter, using them to heat propellant, to generate streams of plasma, to glide silently across space in proof that annihilation can be harnessed, and though such engines would not yet reach other stars, they would mark a turning, a moment when antimatter propulsion steps from theory into practice. You breathe again, steady and calm, and you picture the decades that follow. Larger factories built in orbit, powered by the sun's endless light. Accelerators designed not for experiments, but for production, churning out antimatter at scales still small by dream standards, but vast compared to today, milligrams each year, grams each decade, stored in magnetic bottles as carefully as diamonds in velvet, each one precious, each one destined for research, propulsion, or medicine. You imagine test flights beyond Earth, ships to Mars powered by antimatter-assisted drives, journeys shortened from months to weeks, making a red planet not a distant neighbor, but a reachable frontier. And with each voyage, confidence grows, containment improves, systems become safer, and the fire that once seemed too dangerous to touch begins to feel like a partner. You drift further into centuries, imagining larger stores, kilograms of antimatter cradled in vast magnetic chambers, enough to send robotic probes to nearby stars, enough to push them at a fifth or a quarter of light speed. Messages launch into the dark with journeys measured not in millennia but in decades, and the first images of alien worlds return within the lifetimes of those who sent them. You feel the wonder of this, the quiet awe of humanity stretching its vision outward, not through fantasy but through physics, through engines powered by the most efficient fire the universe allows. You breathe again, calm, and you imagine a long arc continuing, the building of starships not only for machines but for people, vessels with gardens and lights and voices, carrying life itself into the night, propelled by antimatter engines glowing softly, guided by magnetic fields, protected by wisdom, and you realize that though such a vision may lie centuries ahead, it is no longer unreachable. It is written already in the whispers of experiments today. You let this awareness soften into metaphor. The future's fire as a candle passed carefully from hand to hand across generations, each one tending it, each one protecting it, until at last it grows bright enough to light the path to the stars. You rest in this vision, feeling comfort in knowing that impossibility is often only a matter of time, that the fire of annihilation may one day be not only a dream but a vessel. You breathe once more, and as you exhale you sense the story drawing near its close, for beyond the visions of technology lies something quieter, something more personal, a question of meaning. What is your place in this story? What does it mean to be part of a species that dreams of carrying fire into the cosmos, and how does that dream connect to your own life here and now? That reflection waits softly ahead, and you drift toward it into the final chapter, where the journey turns inward again to you and to your place on the living universe. You breathe in slowly, feeling the air fill you like the tide washing over shore, and as you exhale you begin to sense that this journey through antimatter, through rockets and stars, through physics and fire, has been more than a story about technology, more than an exploration of science. It has also been a story about you, about your body resting here now, about your breath, your mind, your quiet place in the living universe. And as you allow this thought to settle, you realize that though you may never hold antimatter in your hand, though you may never ride a starship into the interstellar dark, you're already part of the same story, because the atoms that make you were born in the same fires that make antimatter, the same cosmic processes that light the sun and create positrons in its heart, also gave birth to the elements of your bones and your blood. And so you're already bound to the fire you have been imagining. You are already part of the symmetry, the reflection, the annihilation that becomes light. You picture yourself lying beneath the night sky, the stars scattered above like silver dust, and you know that each one is a sun, each one a furnace where fusion burns, where positrons are born, where light is released, and that light, crossing space for centuries or millennia, arrives at your eyes now, carrying with stories of antimatter long since annihilated, and you realize that a look at the stars is already to see antimatter's trace, already to witness its presence. You breathe again, slowly, and you imagine your life not as separate from this story, but as woven into it. The carbon in your cells formed in ancient stars, the oxygen you breathe released by plants warmed by sunlight that carries antimatter's touch. The very thoughts you hold powered by chemical reactions in your brain that rely on processes tied to physics deeper than you can see. And in this awareness you feel not small but connected, not insignificant, but part of something vast and enduring. You let yourself imagine the future of humanity, the generations that may come after you, building on the patient work of today's experiments, learning to hold antimatter more safely, to use it more wisely, to build vessels that drift toward other suns. And you realize that even if you do not ride those ships, you are still part of their journey, because the dream itself is carried forward through imagination, through knowledge, through stories told and remembered, and your listening now is part of that chain, part of the candle being passed. You let that comfort rest in you like a warm glow, steady and soft. You think of the risks and the promises, of the shadows of safety and the brilliance of possibility, and you know that humanity's relationship with antimatter will always demand humility, patience, reverence, for the same fire that can carry you outward can also burn. The same annihilation that gives motion can also destroy, and you realize that this truth is mirrored in your own life, that your own choices too carry both risk and promise, that your own energy can be used for harm or for care. And so the story of antimatter is also a mirror of responsibility, a reflection of what it means to hold power gently. You breathe once more deeply, and as you breathe, you let your mind soften, drifting into metaphor. For you too are like a vessel, carried forward by hidden fires, guided by forces you do not always see, shaped by the balance of opposites, strength and fragility, longing and contentment, memory and hope, and in this balance lies your journey. You imagine yourself as a starship, moving not through interstellar space, but through the years of your life. Each breath a step of propulsion, each heartbeat a burst of energy, each thought a star flickering in the vastness of your mind. And you realize that though your voyage may not cross light years, it is still a voyage, still a story of motion and change, still part of the great unfolding of the universe. You let this image soothe you, for it tells you that your place among the stars is not distant, not postponed, but here, now, in your being, in your breath, in your quiet presence beneath the sky. You rest in this, and as you rest, you feel the story folding gently closed, not with finality, but with continuation. For the universe goes on, the stars continue to burn, antimatter continues to flicker and vanish. Ships may one day sail, and through it all you remain part of the same whole, a thread in the vast fabric. You breathe once more, soft and calm, and you let your eyes of the mind drift upward to the night sky, to the endless stars, and you know, in the quiet of your being, that you are already at home among them, that your place is secure, your belonging assured, not by distance traveled, but by the fact that you are made of the same light, the same fire, the same mystery, and you drift now into rest, carried by the thought that the story continues, written not only in the stars above, but in the breath within you,